Welcome back. You're still watching The Agenda. So the continent's electoral bodies are converging at the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, for a two-day validation workshop. The General Assembly of the Association of African Electoral Authorities has mandated the IEC to implement resolutions and guidelines for safeguarding electoral integrity in the digital age, as well as coming up with strategies for combating digital disinformation. For more on the story, let's cross live now to SABC News reporter Natasha Phiri, who is in Addis Ababa. Natasha, I think we start off with what it's like there in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, a very interesting part certainly of the continent, and then talk to us about really what is being discussed about the future of elections in the country where digital innovation is concerned.
Well, thank you so much, Naledi. You're quite right. You're coming to you all the way from the heart of Ethiopia and Addis Ababa at the AU headquarters. And like you said, it's quite a pivotal, moment, not only for the IEC, but of course the 15 electoral bodies that are actually here in attendance. For those who don't know, next year is a crucial, year, not only for South Africa as we head to polls, but for 19 other nations on the African continent as they will be heading to the elections. Like you said, we're in Ethiopia, population of over 126 million people, lady. But I mean, the people here are quite warm-hearted. Like you've actually indicated them, the IEC is actually having a two-day validation workshop. And for those who don't know, the IEC is currently the chair of the Association of World Electoral Bodies. It's also the secretariat of the Association of African Electoral Authorities. And the IEC has been mandated, lady, to facilitate a workshop and draft guidelines for electoral bodies in Africa. And of course, these guidelines will be adopted. But for more on this, we're joined by the Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Mr. Alvin Botes. Early on, we actually heard him give a very keynote address there. Quite interesting conversations coming out there. And I heard him actually ask the AU to actually investigate, the phenomenon of social media and, coups around social media. Deputy Minister, thank you so much for joining us on SABC News. Quite interesting inputs that you actually made to these delegates earlier on.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Natasha, and let's appreciate the foresight of SABC to cover this very important aspect because one of the key aspirations from Agenda 2063 speaks about the need to deepen democracy on the African continent. So we welcome the initiative by the Independent Electoral Commission of South Africa that are spearheading the validation process on the guidelines and framework on the use of social media and related technologies in the enhancement of elections integrity. Of course, there is a nexus between the integrity of elections and unconstitutional changes of government. That has been quite qualitatively depicted by the African Peer Review Mechanism, the APRM's 2063 governance report, where it outlined qualitatively the root causes of unconstitutional change of government. And one of the key issues is the matters relating to the architecture of the elections processes that are currently unfolding in Africa.
Minister, I mean, just looking at your role, as the South African government, what inputs could you make, or what inputs have you made within this conference, and the significance of South Africa actually taking and participating in such dialogues?
Well, South Africa, as Department of International Relations and Cooperation, through its African Renaissance Fund, is contributing financially to the realization of the development of the framework and guidelines on social media and related technologies. We do so because we are a proponent of the deepening of democracy. We are an interlocutor as it relates to the enhancements of democratic processes on the African continent. And we do so, Natasha, having in hindsight the fact that it is our ambition that the more than 20 elections that are taking place on the African continent in 2024 would obviously be significantly different to the past elections on the African continent, where we utilize social media in particular as an instrument and mechanism to communicate in unequivocal language on electoral processes. But we also need to put in place measures and mechanisms in relation to misinformation and disinformation, aka fake news, that more than often find expression.
But Minister, I mean, with what you said, how easy is it to actually regulate, social media and those platforms and misinformation as well?
Well, it's quite a complex aspect, but today we have a number of communications technology companies, multinational companies that are present. For example, Facebook, Twitter has a key role to play in terms of credibility of communication that are posted on the different respective social media sites. The fourth estate, the media has a unique responsibility to assist the independent electoral commissions in instances where disinformation and misinformation are communicated. So I think what we are looking is to put in place mechanism through our discussions here today in Ethiopia that will obviously lower anxiety as it relates to the integrity of elections processes.
And just lastly, I mean, how detrimental is misinformation to the work of electoral bodies on the African continent?
Well, Natasha, they always say a lie often repeated becomes the truth. We regard especially communication as paramount. It shapes the ideas, the philosophy, the views of our people. So it's a key aspect when we seek to deepen aspiration 3 of the African Union's Agenda 2063. It speaks about the deepening of democracy.
Minister, thank you so much for your time. Of course, we will catch up with you later on throughout this day. And thank you so much for your inputs. Thank you. Of course, that was the Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Mr. Alvin Botes, and also just giving key inputs from his speech earlier on, just also calling, the AU there to investigate this phenomenon of coups being somewhat fueled by social media. And that was the underlining tone of the first part of these sessions here, Naledi. But of course, as SABC News, we continue to bring you rolling coverage of this story. Later on, we will be joined by one of the CEOs of the IEC, and it's quite important and a very important one for the IEC, Naledi. I mean, a lot of electoral management bodies here have been lauding the IEC for this and for the work done. If I'll just step out of frame, and my colleague Thabiso Rapakwane will actually show you who else is in attendance, despite those 15 electoral bodies and members from the various regions across the African continent. There are also think tanks in attendance. There are also people like William Bird from Media Monitoring South Africa, the likes of Guy Berger. You also have analysts who have actually been roped in, Naledi, to actually form part of that panel that will then adopt those draft guidelines, Naledi, in terms of the electoral integrity in the digital age, as well as coming up with strategies for combating digital disinformation. So very interesting conversations that will be coming up here, and of course the adoption of those guidelines, which are hoped would be actually a worldwide guideline that all electoral bodies, not only on the African continent but across the world, will actually adopt. For now, I'll just toss back to you in studio.
Yeah, very interesting discussions there, Natasha. Thank you so much for the update. That day, Natasha Phiri, coming to us live from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, where critical conversations are taking place around really digitizing elections, certainly on the continent. And I think the local government elections of 2021 showed just what's possible here in South Africa with digitizing our election process.